It's recording. Did it tell you it's recording?
Recording in progress.
Yes. Yes, the Siri voice is because that's apparently what soothes us all.
The white lady voice.
Robotic white lady. Yeah. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to Underworld Party, the interviews where we are interviewing really cool animists and artists about animism and art and other things that are really I think are fascinating. Maybe you don't think are fascinating, but I think they're fascinating. So they're good for me. And today on the podcast, on this, as we're transitioning into the autumn season in North America, which is very interesting, I have lots to say about that. But we have Kate Morales, and Kate is a somatic scribe, and we'll get into what that might be or might not be. But I just want to welcome everyone. We'll do a little prayer because I haven't done one of these interviews in a while, and today I'm doing two in a row. So we're just gonna kind of go with that. So I want to say blessings to all the ancestors, and that means human and non-human and more than human, and all the things that allow us to be here in these bodies to have these conversations and to have relations in general. And may this interview be a blessing in all directions. And I don't know what that means, and that's great. I don't need to know what it means because I'm just a little hair on the skin of the earth. So this little hair on the skin of the earth wants to say welcome, Kate. If there's anything you want to say to enter the space, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I'll just join you in welcoming in Virgo season, coming off of this full moon that was pretty intense for me. Feeling very human today. Very, very hair on the skin of the earth. It's good to start this conversation knowing my place.
Yeah, sure. Right on. And so, there's not really a plan, but I'm super interested in the current iteration of your work, which we're calling somatic scribing. But I don't necessarily want you to do a kind of one-on-one explanation of that because I'm sure they can go to a website or there's some other way people can figure it out. But what I'm really interested in is like, where are you at in that process that is really kind of like on the edge or exciting, that's really getting your juices flowing. So it's almost like we can we're starting in the middle of a conversation, right? We're starting at the beginning. We're starting way in the middle of a journey. And I think that that might be fun to start.
Mhm. um, well, asking about what's kind of like getting my blood flowing. I think I want to start by sharing a story of my yesterday, uh, which kind of connects to a learning that's kind of been over the past month. But yesterday, I stuck my hand in a wasp's nest while I was harvesting muscadines, um, and so today, I can't really bend my thumb. It's pretty swollen and very painful. And so, edge of my learning is really with like sacred pain in my body, and really like, which is a term I first kind of encountered from Vanessa Andreotti and Cash Agnew for um, on Coast Salish territories in Vancouver, Indigenous scholars. So that lesson has been really present for me in the past couple of weeks, really around like, I think that I have been calling in more intense somatic experiences because most of the somatic spaces I roll in is very like ASMR voice, like let's be soothing and gentle and find the pleasant meow meow, and like I'm
Yeah,
here
sure.
for that. And there's a part of me that's also like, I want the intensity.
Yeah.
And so, prayers answered. That's kind of where I'm starting
Yeah, yeah.
today, is like really tracking and attenuating not only pain, but specifically um, the beings that come with guardian energy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so another piece is that I was on a fasting ceremony a couple weeks ago, and I got kissed by the guardian oak, aka poison oak.
Yeah.
Um, and I've had some very powerful transformative experiences that um, with that plant guide teacher,
Mm-hmm.
that are really teaching me how to listen in a decolonial way to my body and to the other beings that I share space with.
For sure. Yeah, what it brings up in me is, I'm in the middle of this 4-part book club with Tyson Yunkaporta's Sand Talk, doing a collaboration with Jeremy, and then in September, Larissa will join me to host the last two. But, Tyson talks about how violence is distributed amongst the network of beings in an ecosystem or a clan in Indigenous Aboriginal Australia. But he also talks about there's no word for safety because that's bullshit, right? And Westerners love this fucking word just as much as they love trust and hope, right? It's like there's like a trifecta of like pedestalized word beings that are actually connected to spirit. So let's not be wrong about this. There is a spirit at the end of every word hole that you want to put your head into. But that there's no word for safety because safety is a kind of spectrum. It's a kind of mythological spectrum of like safe enough or you have the skill to deal with it,
Yeah.
and he talks about that there is a word for protection, which is interesting because he doesn't say there's a word for defense. He says there's a word for protection, right? So defense automatically makes you think of attack, and it's very binary, right? Oh, the defenders have to protect themselves against the attackers. But in nature, this is not really the case because for every being is both an eater and an eater. Like every being is both predator and prey in some capacity, and we have to get away from the herbivore carnivore model to understand this, right? It's like everybody's eating somebody.
Mhm.
And everybody is being eaten by somebody, whether that's in small time or large time, right? And so I've been thinking about this etymology of like the spirit of protection, which is not the same thing as the spirit of defense or the spirit of attack or the spirit of safety. And sacred pain and sacred violence being distributed as a kind of, I don't know, gift or learning, growth, mutation, or catalyst, right? Like a catalytic encounter where
Yeah.
like you get hurt, but it's not like you're betrayed,
Mm.
right? It's not like you were betrayed by Nate by the wasp because you stuck your hand in their nest, right? Whereas another person might feel their betrayal wounds ramp up if that happens, right? Like, oh, Mother Earth betrayed you. And it's like, whoa, like that I think is touching on this like colonial wound of like Earth being this kind of violent betrayer and that we're gonna somehow sanitize. Like, it's like a real weird dynamic. So that's where my mind goes when we talk about these kinds of things.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. And it feels like what is really alive in the cultural soma of facilitated space right now is this question of, okay, we're post safe space um, era, and it feels like we're right on the brink of starting to get into, I see you doing this, I feel like I'm trying to do this, of transferring the conversation to talk about skill, like what amount of skill do I have, and how do I let people, a question I have as a facilitator is like, how do I let people know the sort of edges of the container, and what you can bring in that the container will hold, and what you will bring in that the container cannot hold or is not designed to hold.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
That's a
and
real
just
honesty just from the
being
beginning, right?
honest
Like,
about that.
so honest, right? Like,
Yeah, and there's something else that comes up for me. I was journaling last night about this, and I like to think about all of the characters on my bus, um, like taking turns driving. And so I found this new character on my bus who I'm calling, what did I call them? The pedagogical dissociator.
yeah, sure. Okay.
Who's like I literally, as I was getting stung, like in real time, I am getting stung by wasps. And there was a voice in my head that was like, I wonder what this means. I'm in this course about fire right now. Maybe I should connect this to, and it was, I totally let this person drive a lot because I love learning, and it's how I grow and da da da, but not while a thing is happening.
Sure. Yeah.
It takes me out of just being able to experience something. And I think when I talk about finding a decolonial relationship to my body, that voice is actually just trying to dissociate from discomfort
Yes.
or from a strong sensation that I don't want to feel, or feels like it's too much or whatever.
Right.
And you know as I manage and kind of am with shifting my relationship from being in pain to being with pain,
Mhm.
specifically across my moon cycle, I've caught myself doing the brain thing of being like, it's okay, womb. You just feel whatever you need to feel. And my womb is like, motherfucker, I know. I know that I'm going to feel what I need to feel. Like, you are late to this party.
Yeah.
Like,
It's
yeah,
real.
I was not actually waiting around for your permission
Yeah.
to feel some shit. And that just feels really connected to lots of ways that the sort of colonial imaginary wants to, like, find something that's alive and then give it permission, or like welcome it into a space. um, it's
It's
just
like
the
that.
thing.
It's like that thing where like the road doesn't go through the forest, or like you know what I mean? That weird metaphor. What is it? It's like, yeah, the forest or the tree doesn't block the road. The road blocked the tree. It's like it's the other way around. Like who was here first is kind of the more bigger context. Is like the energies, the beings, the relationships that are already present have already been present for about like a few billion of our perceptual years, right? Like we're perceiving time and we're, oh, that's a 3 billion years. Another way to say it is that it's already here.
Yeah,
It's already been here. Like pain has already been like hanging out. And it just comes to the forefront every now and then in our attention, right?
yeah,
Right? It comes to our forefront of our perception. And then we go, oh, pain is here. And then somehow pain goes away, like we cure it. It's like, how do you cure something that's always drifting in and out of foreground, background kind of environmental perception? And I think that we're reckoning with that as humans because we have this weird object constancy problem. Like if I don't see it, it's not there. And when I turn around, I'm like, oh, it just appeared. And it's
uh-huh.
like, no, that's not really how things are happening.
Yeah, and that might be a good inroad into somatic scribing because basically, as this is happening in our sort of human ecologies and in our social ecologies, and to a wider degree our ecological ecologies, so too are they happening inside of our bodies. And so as a sort of space holder and a space curator, as we're kind of negotiating, like, ouch, that there's something in here that just hurt me. And you know as a facilitator, if I'm like, okay, pain, you're welcome to be here, like, it's the sort of like decolonial approach for me is like, how can we already be tracking what's happening inside of our bodies, and um being in relationship with sensations in an animist kind of way, or the spirits that come through us and possess us in an animist kind of way, and um, do less of the like, okay, you're here, and be in a little bit more of a flow. And the scribing part of that is helping people make that connection between what's happening in our physical bodies and what's happening in our cultural bodies. So like,
Mhm.
a cultural example of like white people pouring into the street with Black Lives Matter signs and stuff, like Black people were like, yeah, homie, we know that already.
Yeah, sure.
um and like, what kind of links can we make to this sort of perceived separation of our brains talking to our bodies in really sort of patronizing ways, or
Mhm.
patriarchal ways, or colonial ways, or oppressive ways. And so
Right.
the scribing part is like, let's make this visible, to really, then we can do something, because we know actually the state of the health that our bodies are in.
Right. Like we're moving from a kind of like, I think, and this is I'm on the edge of my seat too, which is like, how do we move from this context of thinking that things go from one change to another, like evolution, right? Oh, now I was a baby and now I'm an adult. There's this transformation in which like you walk through a door and you have a new costume and suddenly that's like the beginning of something, right?
Mm.
To this other model of like all of these happenings are latent in the system, and all we are doing is revealing what's already happening under the surface. And then we name something and we think that the naming that we did is the thing. So, like when the flower bud or the flower stem pops through the earth, somehow that's a moment of something. And I think it is, but the flower or the tree or whatever has been growing for like a long time already under the surface doing things that we are not naming. We're just like, oh, it happens now because it popped up through the soil or the concrete or something, and now it's blooming, and that's the thing we fixate on. But there's this already always coalescing of things, emergent and decaying at the same time. Like it's not just emergent. Like we see this where it's like, oh, emergent XYZ. It's like, yeah, but that's like saying sunrise, sunset or something. Like it's like inhale, exhale. It's like what isn't emerging? Like it's just another way to say like, oh, that's the unit. Like, oh, things are happening. But we, as a kind of culture who's pretty remedial, in my opinion, we kind of have an insight, and then we go, oh, now I see this insight happening everywhere. And it's like, but you might not even know what you're talking about. Like it's already been happening. You're just trying to name a thing that's already happening so that we can talk about it. And I think that that's very useful. And I think that what you're doing as a scribe is illuminating or revealing, maybe making transparent what's already fucking going on, right? And in that moment, I think we as facilitators have to deal with the kind of shock that people go through when you're basically saying, yeah, I see this thing now, you're just realizing it. But
Mhm.
also realize that like it's been happening the whole fucking time. Like your whole life this is happening. And even beyond that time span. And people are having this experience, and I think we've all had it, right? Where we go, "Oh, this is the moment where I received the revelation," right? And then the spirit's like, "No, let me show you how that was happening 40 years ago."
Yeah.
Like it's not happening. It's like you're just catching up. You're so late to the party, buddy. Like you're so late. And I've had those experiences with spirits, and I actually feel grateful that like that level of honesty can be communicated if a person is willing to sort of ask like, what have I been missing? Rather than like show me the way. It's like, no, just tell me what I've been fucking missing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you and I have talked about this a lot before, around like this inquiry around like how can we create conditions to feel the pleasure of humility, and the humility, the hum of the humility being like hummus, humus, down, the like down and out that's it's so pleasurable to have your energy shift down and out, and is the is the is probably the thing that we're really all longing for. and
Yeah.
and yeah, so as a um as someone, I've been sitting at this intersection for a while of somatics practice and scribing, and one of the pieces that feels mine to do particularly is, as I started doing a bunch of research. It was separate research. I was looking up some gay shit, actually. I was looking up some
Yeah.
gay shit about my gay ancestors, my gay Nawa ancestors, and I found all of this information about scribes in Nawa culture. So like Aztec, Central Mexico, Mexica, Aztec, Zapotec, and um, there's a there was a role of a scribe in that culture. Nawa wasn't written in an alphabetic language; it was a pictorial, ideographic, pictographic language, and the word to scribe, tlaquiloyi, actually meant to paint, to carve, to tattoo, and kind of, it was like putting into image the spoken word. Um, and it was a whole role in society of the person who would like listen to the priests and listen to the astronomers and astrologers and translate that and then perform that or put it up in a public place. So it was a social art. It wasn't like people were like going to the library to like read the books. It was like, here's the codex and here's the person who performs the information, and it's written down because we are kind of, this is how the epistemology gets translated. These ideas are not fixed into sort of definitive definition boxes. They're like invocations that a person sort of embodies into the public, into the commons. So it's the social art that when the Spanish came, were like, this is the devil, and they burned everything that they could. And so for me to be in a field of visual practitioners who are like, we invented this in the 90s. I'm like, no, homie, you actually rediscovered a thing that was brutally exterminated on this continent. And we're gonna keep reproducing the thing that's causing us harm unless we go back and do sort of like reparative acknowledgement of I'm going to throw in a big word of epistemicide. So basically epistemology being the way that we how we construct knowledge together was so different then, and is being resuscitated now in the 21st century, because we are moving to a place where words that are treated like the worship of the written word kind of being this sort of like Western post-enlightenment white supremacist sort of like cultural piece that we're like, this doesn't serve us anymore. The way that we use words as boxes, the words come with borders and comes with police. So our whole epistemology is a carceral epistemology, and we're like, there's enough of us who are like, I don't want to play that anymore. That changing the way that we create knowledge together by putting it back into pictures that don't make sense until we talk about it and create a constellation of meaning.
Yeah.
That doesn't the sum of it doesn't end up as the capital T truth.
Yeah.
That's what we're calling in, and there's actually history of that across every culture. And so, it's an important part for me as we develop this out, this contemporary art practice, to be really rooting it in historicizing and contextualizing it for me, in my ancestral lineage. And I'm wanting more people to join me in that.
Totally. Totally. I mean, there's so much here. There's so much here. Like, so, we have this idea of the culture wars. And some people call them like the meme wars, right? Like wars of ideas, which are basically gods. And those come with a kind of set and setting. It's like what you said, like words come with a kind of social imaginary that predefines what we think we're allowed to even think or feel when we say that word spell, because it's a spell, right? And then we have this thing of like epistemicide, which I think is actually still completely, we're in the middle of it. We're in the middle of an epistemicidal war on all fronts, in my opinion. And you introduced me to that term, and I've been using it a lot more. And it's actually like more functional than just saying culture war, because you're actually saying, well, what's a culture? It's how you relate. And you're actually oppressing people's way of relating, is what you're doing.
Mhm.
You're saying, nope, this way that you talk to the tree or talk to each other or have sex with whom that you have it, we're going to come in and say, nope, because the way to control people is control their bodies, but it's control how their bodies relate to other bodies
Yeah.
and how their bodies know that they're relating to other bodies. So the knowing is this feedback loop of like, well, I know there's an effect happening because of XYZ factors. I'm having sensations, I'm having dreams. My grandma came and talked to me. Like you have a wide variety of sort of epistemic markers or signal flares or something, right? Coming back to you from the ecological environment that you're embedded in, right? Like your skin is essentially absorbing and emitting pheromones. Like there's this whole wave of everything talking, right? And then we kind of gather it up and we say, okay, I think this is a word, or I think this is a phrase or a story that's coming from this sort of glut of sensations. But even how we determine, like how we think we know what that story is the thing. Because what I see, and I'm sure, we're talking to the choir here, but when we're teaching people who are steeped in a Western culture, their imaginary, their ability to imagine in a decolonial animistic way is like brutalized.
Yeah.
Is brutalized.
Yeah.
So we're asking them to imagine a world in which they could receive love just by breathing, and they are like, my legs are broken. Like I hear screams when I do that.
Yeah.
And I'm, putting it all together. It's like, right, because your ancestors' way of knowing, which was once whole and intact and part of a place, was tortured to death. And now you're wondering why you feel so fucking alone and betrayed. And when I tell you to breathe and just let your shit go down and out, you only hear screams and ghosts, right? It's like, and in some way, that's the epistemicide talking to you, going, why do you think it's so hard for you to do this? Right? So it even starts with like, it's like the veil behind the veil, right? Because we're not coming into this fresh like babies. We're coming into it with with like a codex already written in our DNA and our blood, right?
Yeah. I'm so glad that you said that. It's making me um it's making me recall a sort of inquiry that I had on my fast of like, how can I, so bringing back in the pedagogical dissociator, post dissociation of the one who's just like, okay, what can I learn about this right now? Something that's come up for me is like, actually, maybe I am being invited to be the guardian oak, or to be the guardian wasp, whose medicine is to say, enough, don't come here. This is a disturbed place. There's been pain here. There is currently healing happening here. And you need to move with a lot more caution and care. And like, I totally want to be the guardian oak for the people who just blow past the signs. We're just like, oh, I'm just gonna harvest some muscadines,
Yeah.
like so I'm so just feeling so grateful for that medicine. And um maybe can I tell a story of the oak?
Yeah,
So
please. Yeah, yeah.
kind of at the height, so I'm not allergic to poison ivy. So I wasn't even paying attention to the guardian oak because I was like, I don't know what you do. And then I got it, and I never had a rash before, and I spread it, and I just did all the things wrong. And um, I was invited to do some work at an indigenous eco village in my bioregion. And one of the days I was in the garden just weeding, and there's no English in the garden. And so it's beautiful, just like such a sacred experience. But I was sweating, and it was inflaming all of the oaks. And then I started getting bitten by fire ants. And then I got bit by another wasp. And the whole time I was doing the thing of like, okay, be with the pain. Here I am. It's a sensation that's stinging. Okay, now I'm kind of feeling the neurotoxins diffuse into the, like, I'm like trying to do the good somatic thing. And clearly that was not the lesson, because I kept getting more and more and more and more. And finally, I crossed the threshold of what I could handle. And at first, like, my mind flipped, and I started saying a ton of mean things to myself. I was with a couple of white folks. I started going off on like the fucking white people, like for no reason at all. Just got really, really mean. And finally caught myself and was like, let me go take a break. I forgot that I could do that, which is another important part of the story. I forgot that I could just walk away because I had a job. It was important for me, and it was important for my ancestors to like do the job. And so when I realized that I could just go take a break, and I didn't have to be like, what does the pain mean? And so, I like went over into the shade, and I was kind of like rubbing my skin. And I had this memory of, well, it wasn't my memory. I guess it was a memory of a story of a memory of my grandfather, who was a migrant worker. Our family were migrant workers. And I remember as a child being told that he had to pick cotton when he was a kid, like when he was a little kid. And so that's just like one little thread in the tapestry of our family. And it kind of just like popped through my head and popped out. And then I was like, wait. I just had a memory of being poked and cut. Somehow I had this memory of my grandfather as a child being poked and cut picking cotton. And I didn't get there until I was so over my threshold of the pain, of the itch and the stabbing, and the, that came up for me. And I realized that I was that voice of like thinking that I was doing the right thing to be in my body was missing the whole thing, which was the spirit of like that child, the child of my grandfather, who didn't have an adult say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. You shouldn't have had to do that. And I'm going to make sure that that doesn't happen to you again. And I was silencing that voice in me.
Yeah.
And when I finally let it through, I could, that voice was wanting to protect me, saying like, you shouldn't have to hurt like this. And then I could say like, I see you. Thank you for taking care of me. We're gonna take a break now, and let everything calm down. And also, that's not what's happening right now. Like, you're on sovereign indigenous land, which is such a holy medicine and pleasure and gift to get to be weeding this garden right now. And then I could open up to the wider context of like giving blessings to all of the descendants of the enslaved people who were working probably cotton on that land, of which like my little story is a tiny little blip compared to the trauma that earth specifically holds. And then it could sort of like, send prayers out to what was really happening, and what pain was really being held on that earth, and the little ways that, caring for it, and being in conversation was a part of
Right.
that healing.
Right. Yeah. And did you return to the did you return to the garden after you did that and took that break? And
Yeah,
if so, was there a difference? Like what was the somatic experience of returning to the garden?
it was beautiful. It was, I mean, that's the return to the garden was a shift from like the sort of self-centered learn to the like attack to be like, thank you, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and like, may may you know the work that's done here be like ripple out to be a blessing for the people who were survivors um of enslavement on this land. And that was beautiful. And as I was working in the sun again, like, I got hot again, I got bit again, and it was healing also for me to say, okay, now you're done.
Right.
um
Right.
you don't have to work until the end of your shift right now.
Right. There's something here about like, and I've experienced this off and on throughout my life. I started out maybe professionally started out on this pathway when I joined massage school in my mid 20s. And you learn to sort of, there's a certain way that you have to approach another body that holds pain and also other things, right? Because it's not just sacred pain that they're holding all their resistances to that, to feeling that pain. And they're holding all their ancestors' pain. And of course, this is like most people are dissociated from that reality. But as a massage therapist, you're not dissociated from that reality because it's literally like right there. It's like you're opening up to a kind of sensory process that actually is exploratory, which is to say, I don't know what's here, but oh, there's something else, and there's something else, and there's something else. And that something else is a someone else. Usually there's a relational dynamic. It's not like a thing. It's not like, oh, here's a thorn, I'll just pick it out. It's like, no, this is a relationship dynamic that's here. This is a kind of like whole tapestry of causes and effects and feelings about those causes and effects, and like things that aren't settled and things that are not resolved and things that are still held within the body, right? Like a holding on to grudges or a holding on to whatever, grudges, betrayals, revenges, all of this stuff. And I took that lesson. Like, I never became a professional massage therapist because I didn't have the skill to actually do what the body was asking me to do. Because I was having these really trippy fucking experiences massaging people where like lights would fly out of their body or like attack me. And I was like, oh, I'm not going to get the training I need in this Western Swedish massage course about what the fuck is really happening. No one's going to talk to me about it because that's not the game here. The game here is like make people feel better. It's like, no, there's a fucking ghost here. There's ghosts coming out of this dude's belly. What the fuck are you talking about? And of course, I didn't even have the language to say it so funny back then, but I took that to kind of mean that like in some strange way, and maybe it's not strange at all, but like in some way, and I'm sourcing some of this knowledge because I had a really profound experience reading a book called Red Medicine by Patricia Gonzalez, and she's kind of like you. I think she is a descendant of Nahua and Aztec and Mayan people, and she's also like a professor at like Santa Fe. I don't know exactly, but she's like a big adjunct professor and writes the books and teaches the classes, but also has like been apprenticed for like 25 years in like curanderismo and birthing specifically. And she wrote this book called Red Medicine that I actually want to revisit it now, a few years after reading it. And I actually just got an older book that she did called The Mud People, which I think is going to be really cool. Yeah, yeah. It's about like, yeah, so it's like, well, So she talks about how like these techniques of healing, which we could call massage medicine, these techniques of healing, whatever that means, that's actually happening all the time. Like there's no demarcation between, like, the baby's coming, right? So the baby's coming, the water breaks. But in some way, the earth is pregnant with all of us already. So there's no water break. Like, it's like the whole cycle is engrossed in a larger cycle of alreadiness happening. So I'm I'm both pregnant and the baby of right now, of multiple wombs and multiple mothers going past the human,
Yeah.
right? And so there's a kind of like always already happening, so that when the sacred birth worker invokes the five guardian deities into their fingers to catch the baby, they're also catching themselves, and they're also already, it's already happened to them. So it's a complete and total like phase shift of time, where time kind of not necessarily collapses onto itself, but is actually revealed for what it actually is, which
Mhm.
is like this moment is all moments. This
Mhm.
moment of birth is the birth of all beings. And it's the birth of me, it's the birth of you, and it's also death. It's also the death, like it's also the funeral of it's like and and the person who is doing the massage is actually accepting the responsibility to know that.
Yeah.
So the epistemology of this like responsibility is actually your skin is actually saying, yes, I will allow the conscious mind to finally stop dissociating from what's actually happening all the time. So when I'm walking along the ground, that's the same thing.
Mm.
So we always go, oh, but this is the ritual of the birth, and this is the ritual of the funeral, and this is the ritual of the dinner. But it's like, no, no, no. Walking on the earth, touching the earth with your bare feet or even with your shoed feet is the same massage, birthing, death practice. It's the same thing. So we just dissociate because we don't want to feel that all the time, but actually breathing the air is the same process, because it's a process of like interpenetration of tissues. And the touching and the massaging of breathing is also the birthing, the dying, the eating of the food, the shit, like it's all of it. And the massage therapist, the curandera, or whoever it is, whoever the person is who has decided by some strange twist of fate that they're going to try to like be responsible as part of the trail of bodies who are like, yeah, it's my turn. It's my turn now. Yeah, sure, it's my turn. It's my turn to cook dinner. It's my turn to deliver the baby. It's my turn to hospice the dying, whatever it is. But then to realize that, like, in the grand scheme of things, there's no turning off that epistemology.
Mhm.
We can temporarily blunt it through all the ways that we blunt it, and all the ways that our ancestors are like, no, I don't want to deal with that right now. But then there are these moments of opening where it's like, no, let's just actually recognize, like, the pain is actually knocking on your door and saying, hey, just open the fucking door. Like, I would stop bugging you if you open the fucking door. And then we're always like, but I'm not prepared to open the door. And it's like, yeah, but no one's ever really fucking prepared to open the door. It's like, that's why we have all these damn techniques to be like, okay, I protect myself and I wash myself and I bathe myself and I smoke myself and smudge myself. It's because no one's ever fucking ready. So we do all these things to get a little bit more acclimated to that process, right? Which is already always happening, which I guess is the thing again. It's like, it goes into this really strange place where like, and this is where I want your sort of like, understanding of like the spirit of knowing or the spirit of epistemology is like, how are you delineating the threshold between somatic scribing and then your regular life? Is there a difference? Are you always somatically scribing in some dream world? Like, are there threshold changes that you see as just sort of illusory, like, and then how do you like flip that to people who are like coming to you to be like, hey, I want to do this thing about, like what is that process of like showing people the mirror, I guess I could say.
Yeah. Well, I love that you brought in the example of the massage therapy, and I've just started learning craniosacral, so that's my one little like insight
Totally.
into the and I started doing that explicitly because my question around somatic scribing is essentially how does the facilitator become the naturopath? How does the person whose role, everybody's got a role, the facilitator's role, how can that shift into like, and the scribe, so the facilitator, the scribe, the kind of like person who's like, here's the diagnosis of what's in our body. That's the scribe's role. That's been my role for the time that I've been. It's like, here's the diagnosis of what's in our body. And so my next question from there is like, well, what, we're sitting on all of these prescriptions, like what, so then whose role is it to come in and be like, great, here's a resource, here's a challenge, here's where the flow is blocked, here's the person hoarding the resources, if we diffuse this, like, and it's experimental, and I'm not a naturopath, and so it's a question that I can't answer in this moment, um, around how the facilitator becomes the naturopath of the cultural soma. um, And to your question around, where are the thresholds? Is it something that happens all the time? Um, that's the part that feels like queer and decolonial for me, is kind of pointing out the porosity of the fronteras, of the boundaries, of the things that we think are discrete and really are not. Um, and putting scribing, like reframing scribing a um, as a system of writing, a legitimate system of writing. That's not an alphabet. That's not a pictogram. It's not an ideogram. It's a new, actual, legitimate, whatever
Yeah.
way of writing, opens up the possibility, because we've got the worship of the written word as the truth of how we know things and how we know things to be true, and how we, information kind of gets like disseminated, and how it lives on beyond us, and so much of how we understand creating knowledge is through writing and books. And so if we open that up to be like, oh no, actually these pictures are writing, oh no, actually these symbols are writing, oh no, actually the pattern on my shirt is writing, oh no, the architecture of this room is writing, oh actually, what's not writing.
Yeah.
um I
Right.
think that sort of like, you follow that trail down to be like, well, everything is writing. So that's my sort of trail into the everything is everything.
Yeah.
And once you just need to crack it a little bit. um I I just want to crack the colonial imaginary of writing being the truth just a little bit, to be like, well, let's do writing and pictures.
Right.
And then I think that it tumbles into like,
Right.
actually we construct meaning together, and we know things together in every expression of ourselves that we have.
Right.
And that's also to me why it feels like there's a queer sort of pedagogy underlying the work that I do too, which is like my new kind of like understand, my favorite understanding right now, the like elevator pitch understanding of what queerness is just believing that there's more than they ever told you is possible. And so queerness to me is my core freedom practice, is my core liberation practice. And I think holding that anchor, even when I can't really see what's possible, and I actually can't know what's possible from this sort of imaginary that I sort of colonized imaginary that I have. But if I can hold that there's much more possible, and I can make little cracks now and follow those, and see where they lead me, um,
Mhm.
that's where I think that the colonial healing happens, and where we can kind of be in liberation practices together.
Yeah, I mean, something that is just coming up for me is like, so a lot of how we know things or how we begin the process of researching or experimenting or whatever is an inquiry process, right? So we ask a question, and it's funny that like the word querying is kind of hidden inside the word question and inquiry, right? It's like the query. What's
Hmm.
the query? But then there's like this queer thing, and like, I'm just putting that together now where it's like, look, these words are the same word, and we've decided that they're different words. But like, the reality is that there's something weird going on here in which asking the question produces perceptions that we couldn't predict, right? So if I ask what else is possible, that's a real powerful question because I'm going to open myself up to all manner of phenomenon that I have no reference for.
That's right.
And therefore, I cannot control, and that might bring up all my fear. So then there's this thing about like, well, you asked what was in the box, and inside the box, there's like a thing that, whoa, that's real. And I think that colonialism is about, in some way, disturbing or oppressing your ability to ask the right kinds of questions, right? So, like, questions become dangerous. Like the child asking, well, why can't I have sex with that kind of person becomes dangerous, right?
Hmm.
And becomes a kind of the carceral spirit erupts from that moment, right? Because the carceral spirits are looking for those kids because we already know that's what's going to happen. The kid's going to ask the question nobody wants to answer, or nobody in the oppressed culture wants to answer, obviously, right? And so the carceral spirit is going to work to clamp down all eruptions of this inquiry
Hmm.
process that the child is naturally going to do because the child isn't choosing that either. The child isn't choosing the inquiry process. One might say that the child is the inquiry process,
Right.
right?
Yeah, and I would add that the inquiry is also the erotic,
Mm,
and the sort of, one of the sort of primary woundings of the colonial project is separation from wildness and eros in order to be able to control it. And so, um, you know, queer pedagogy to me is learning against and beyond the anti-erotic. Like, we and I think that queer people who live queerly, who are in this inquiry of like, I don't see myself existing in this structure, let me make my own. Like, I'm actually not being loved as much as I deserve in this family, I'm going to go design my own. Oh, I, actually want to build family in a way that I don't see out there in this current moment, I'm going to go try it myself. Like, we're sort of these like de facto, we're sort of like cultural architects of
yeah,
new potentialities for how we be together, and we be in our bodies, and we be in our homes, and we be in our families. And to me, that erotic learning um, doesn't have a place in the institutions that
right,
would try to package it and uh,
right,
control it.
right. Like like how do new social imaginaries develop? Well, they're developing all the time, so maybe different questions are needed. Whereas, like, how do we ensure that new social imaginaries don't get strangled by the social imaginaries that some people have decided are the ones that matter,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, something that I'm really curious about right now is like the pronoun question.
Mhm.
I think one of the primary reasons that the state is invested in continuing to uphold a binary gender system is because they track us and organize us and understand us and control us through all of our documents that have our gender on them. And if it's like that little crack, it's like, well, if we make space for trans people, then we're gonna have to make space for non-binary people. And then we're gonna have to make space for, like the gender variant people. And then we're gonna have to make space for the gender secessionists. And then we're gonna, just like the whole project falls apart.
Right.
Um, and I think that, if we don't know our power, the state does. And we can see
Yes.
that because they're very invested in continuing the current sort of epistemological understandings of who we get to be and how we get to express ourselves.
That's right.
And when we see how strong that's reinforced, even militarily, that to me points to how much power we actually have,
Right.
and how threatening we actually are.
Totally.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that we just get to like go bananas and like design, like the sort of like maw of capitalism is like wide open waiting for us to create the next thing so that it can consume it and sort of continue to feed off of our labor. And so
Right.
it's such a big inquiry for me around, how we sort of like design the new system and the death throes of capitalism that can kind of go fly under the radar enough that they can live without kind of being co-opted, and the erotic spirit of these new ways of knowing doesn't get eaten and put back into a box.
Right.
It's kind of like how in certain spiritual traditions, you don't say the word God, you don't paint pictures of God, you don't describe God, because God is beyond definition. It's beyond the sort of like carcerality of a border. It's an invocation. It's not a description, it's an invocation. And so, how do we create knowledge that's an invocation, that can kind of slip out of the ways that the sort of dominant power structures want to keep it managed and contained and controlled.
Right. Right. Because a description describes what a thing is not. As much as it describes what you think a thing is, it describes what you think it's not.
Yeah.
And an invocation is a kind of inquiry into an I don't know process that is inherently terrifying on some level because you don't fucking know what's happening. But that also, it also sort of brings in wider and wider, more meaning, like multiple, 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 plural, 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 queer, 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 weird, 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 like more like things that aren't things. They're unthingable, right? It's unthingable. Like, what is this thing we're talking about? Well, it's not a thing in the first place. It's a process between bodies, and we can't even see it. We can't even measure it. We can barely sense it, but we know on some level we know it's happening, but we can't map it really.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we have this urge to map it all the time. Like all the time, like, let me map God. And it's like, I'm part of that too. It's like I love like mapping, and then at a certain point, you have to destroy the map. You have to destroy the map. And if you don't have, if your language or your epistemology, your ways of knowing, your ways of calculating, your ways of orienting, which is like what a map is a way of orienting, right?
Mm-hmm.
If your ways of orienting don't have built-in self-destruct mechanisms, you have to create them.
Yeah.
Because without that self-destruct mechanism, you actually get trapped in your fucking map.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Oh, I have so many points to say on that. I mean, one, I just want to mention that in my study into Nahuatl, which I'm not a speaker of Nahuatl, so I am not at license to really talk with any authority about what it is, but what I have understood is that there's no word for to be in Nahuatl. So there's our fixation with identity of, I'm a queer, non-binary, mixed race, meow, meow, meow. Like, it's like, here's my box, 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 box. And we like participate in like jumping into these two small definitions of our godness and our queerness. And so that's one little point, is like why it's important for me to go back and be and really pull myself out of a sort of contemporary post-colonial as much as I can, like, kind of like peer through the fence and,
Yeah.
and try to understand what it could possibly be like
Right.
to describe the world, to map the world, because that is my actual job,
Yeah.
in a way that um doesn't be like, this is what this is. It's just like this, not this is, just this. There's
Right.
this,
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Totally.
and we're not going to say any more about it. We're not going to say what it is. We're not going to, it's just, here's two
Mm.
things.
Right.
um and last year I was living in on southern Pomo territory in Northern California, and I was walking through the redwoods and came across this dead tree, and I was just like, what a misnomer. There is no such thing as a dead tree. This tree is so teeming with life. And um it got me thinking about, you know, the sort of mother tree move of like, it's my time, here's all the resources I've accumulated, I'm going to distribute them back out into the network
Right.
um of other trees around me. And I was just like, how, first of all, that's really gay. um
Sure.
a really gay way of being in relationship with other beings. And I was like, how can this wisdom be infused into the nonprofit world, which is kind of where I play, where everybody's like, we have to accumulate all of these resources and make sure that we're distributing them in the right way, and then we don't sense when it's time to transition, and when it's time to be like, and we're not fulfilling our mission anymore, here's how these resources can go back into the system. They don't go anywhere, but we allow ourselves to go through, like, complete the cycle of like, here was us at our best, we're starting to peak, now we're going to help ourselves transition into a really nice easeful death, where people aren't losing their jobs and are in housing
Right.
crises and stuff. It's like,
Right.
it's done in a way where there's like the breath of the, here's resources accumulating, here's resources diffusing.
Right.
And not being so obsessed with like the legacy piece.
Yeah. Totally.
we're
Well,
only really we're only really valuable if we're reproducing in this kind of heteronormative way.
sure. And in
Yeah.
a kind of way that's like, it's not actually natural as well. Let's just say it for real. It's like, it is an unnatural way of trying to resist nature itself, right? Like, because if death is redistribution, then we have to ask ourselves why the colonial imaginary has such fucked up ideas about death, right? Like, you just have to go like, what if death is redistribution and every exhale is another chance to practice redistribution, and you could just redistribute every day because night happens every day, and every season there's a and every year, if there's always a built-in dying of every point in time and space that we can map, we see it all the time, right? It's like things go in this wave pattern, right? It's like, whoa, you know. Then we have to ask why the colonial imaginary has such unnatural, you know, ways of mapping dying, and why dying has to be both a threat, a problem, because legacy is only a thing you have to think about if you are afraid of death.
Hmm.
Because your legacy is just like, oh, that person was a good person. Like, what? They just lived every day and they helped people and they were generous. Like, that's the legacy, right? But the colonial idea of legacy is something very different than what we're talking about.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder. Um, I wonder a lot about like why queerness is just kind of like exploding in this moment. Like, what conditions are now existing that haven't existed before, that are allowing people to, really allowing the binary, the gender binary, which is sign of trauma, right? Binaries are like, something bad happened and it's this or it's this, because we can't hold complexity anymore. Like, suddenly we're starting to, like, en masse, be able to hold more complexity about how we express ourselves and our love. And I have a elder, Uncle Bug, who told me that in his tradition, he believes that queerness, when queerness shows up in a people, it's a blessing that's like, okay, you have stabilized your population enough. You have enough people kind of reproducing that you're not really at risk of dying out. And now you're blessed with people who aren't necessarily that invested in reproduction in that way, who are actually just gonna fuck because it's nice
Yeah.
and doesn't make a baby. um
Right.
and in that play and in that experimentation, that's how the culture evolves forward. And that's you were talking about how you can't get too stuck in your boxes, otherwise you sort of standardize yourself to death. And I think that, like, that's the link between queerness and death and decolonizing and God, is that it's like, how can we find the edges of what we think exists and keep kind of like feeling our way beyond that. And it's how we'll continue growing and being alive.
Right, because on some level, if we can decolonize death, which is to say death is not a problem, it's not something to solve, it's something to sort of like dance forward to, maybe you could say, or sort of like, and that dance is the redistribution of resources, but it's also like a kind of generation of new possibilities, right? Like all of this good stuff, like, right? Like it's good stuff. But we're trying to decolonize the concepts of death that keep us from actually this flow cycle, or this like kind of cyclical circulation. Because from my perspective, this Taoist animist perspective, whatever, it's like what we're in right now, this kind of thing that we call living in a body, is actually just one part of a constantly shifting cycle of transitory states. But the colonial project, or the colonial imaginary, thinks that this transitory state is not a transitory state. That this is the stable, shouldn't be destroyed, like permanent colony of reality. That spirits are fighting over each other to get to be here. Right? Like there's a kind of weird, like, we need it, so we got to keep it, so we don't want to die because we don't want to leave it, but we're just going to keep destroying it. It's like a very strange chewing on itself problem, because if we understand that this is a transitory state that we pass through and will return to in a different form, then a lot of the preciousness of life goes away, but not in the way that makes it less enjoyable, actually makes it more enjoyable. Because you realize you're not actually losing anything.
Yeah, like I wonder if it reanimates the preciousness back in, like
Yes.
that what we think is death, or what we're actually doing, is like taking something that's cyclical and non-linear, and pulling it out of that circle and into something linear.
Yes.
And that's where we really die.
Yes. That's the real death, is the stagnation of the connection of the entire cycle, which is actually feeding and reanimating you in every single moment.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like unplugging yourself from the wall and then being like, why doesn't this thing work anymore? It's like, well, it's not plugged into a power source. It's like, no, but if I plug it into the power source, I have to admit to myself that I'm just part of a stream, and I'm not actually as important as I think I am. And the narcissistic project of colonialism is to be like, nope, can't do that. Like, and it's that catch-22 of like, well, you want your devices to work, right? You want your breath to breathe you, right? You want your blood to produce more blood. You want, like you want the reanimation, but you don't want the responsibility of connection. But you want the fruits of it. It's like, it doesn't work that way. You have like if you want the fruit, you got to go to the tree, and you got to feed the tree if you want the fruit. No, I just want the fruit. I don't want to feed the tree. It's like, well, I don't know what to tell you, buddy. Like, you're kind of fucked. And the nice part is that the futility of colonialism is that regardless of how it shakes out, you're going to die anyway. So whether you take a long time to get back to the tree or you just go back to the tree tomorrow, that's, I think, is actually the real thing. It's like you can become a ghost for 170 years or something, and then you'll still go back to the tree.
Mhm.
Or whatever the metaphor that we're using, which is to say the cycle of like, you finally become exhausted by your resistance.
Yeah.
And
And
like
I
what you
hope
did in
that
the
we're
garden, right?
there. I
What was that?
really, I think that starting this somatic scribing project is a hope that that enough of us are there that we can start being like, okay, visioning and mapping is going to get us exactly where we started.
Yeah.
And however we think that we can imagine our way out of where we are from this sort of like epistemological place that we're in, like we have to get beyond what we can imagine to really find ourselves at least somewhere different. Maybe we don't get it right, but
Right.
at least we're
Right.
somewhere different
There's
than.
no guarantee that we're going to like what happens, but that's really not really the point. It's
Yeah.
like, well, you didn't like to get stung by a wasp, but now you're like, well, this is really like generative.
Hmm.
It's like I would, like I would try to protect a child if they did this stupid thing, but maybe they need to get stung too. It's like, fuck, like this is that weird thing of like when I look at healing and medicine and trauma healing, especially from the Western colonized point of view, they think they already know what trauma is and is not. And then what we're talking about from the animist somatic perspective is, yeah, I got fucked up. Like I drowned when I was 3. The ocean was like, here, let me help you remember something, buddy. And it took me decades to be like, thank you so much. I had no idea what was going on. I hated it for so long, and I'm sorry about that. And like it's a 30-year cycle. No fucking therapist is going to be able to come and like pat me on the head and be like, oh, just do this. It's like, let's heal that wound. It's like, that is not a one. Is it even a fucking wound?
Yeah. Or is it a teacher?
Is it a teaching? And is it my resistance to its trueness that is actually the issue? My resistance to imagining what it could possibly be is actually the problem. It's my imagination about that was a bad thing. And if I go, well, what if I don't know if it was a bad thing? What if it was just a thing and it has multiple tendrils? It's tentacular. It was a thing I reacted to in these 25 ways. And then there's more ways too. That's more of the eruption of like the mycelial network coming through. It's like there's 7,000 genders and none of them are better than any other. So like, why are you doing this thing? Like, why are you judging? And then you have to deal with like, oh, right. Like the question that I have is the wrong question. And that's where you get the gift, right? To recognize that the questions we have from one point of view are not all the questions we could be asking. I mean, but we still have to go on that journey to get to that point where the questions we're asking become exhausted of themselves. And we go, fuck, I've just been asking the wrong question. Thank you for that journey. Let me ask a better one or a different one. Maybe it's not even better. Maybe it's just totally 400 degrees to the left. You're like, well, keep looking at this brick wall. What if I just do this?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you want to talk a bit about the very next things that you're up to.
Yeah, hopefully it's bringing in more exhausted people
Yeah, yeah.
who are like, well, that didn't work. But yeah, I've just launched a lab. I'm calling it the Somatic Scribing Lab. It's a it's a course where the content of what we're doing is looking at visual practices, facilitation practices, space holding practices. So, thinking about teachers, therapists, facilitators, scribes, artists, people who are kind of at this intersection of um, telling the cultural soma about itself and holding space for it to kind of perceive itself. And it's an invitation to be deepening in our experimentation of what else that could be, while at the same time kind of like doing some reflexive process on the body that we're creating together, and making an attempt, or playing. It's really invoking the spirit of play to come in and be like, okay, well, we're a body, so how about we organize ourselves, starting with a birth, and then figure out how to breathe, and then figure out how to eat and how to digest and how to rest and how to bathe and how to fuck and how to die. And so that's kind of the arc of the lab. And so we'll be tracking ourselves as a body, and what comes up in our body. And then, my goal is to kind of pull people together to be doing more research about contextualizing these sort of new forms of epistemological practice, visual practice, space holding practice, anchoring it into our own ancestral traditions. And just, I don't know what will come out of it.
Yeah.
But those are some of the like seeds that I've strewn.
Yeah.
And what we do together will kind of depend on who feels a yes.
Totally. And do you have a website for where people can I mean, I'll put it in the show notes obviously, but just so that it's audio captured.
Yeah, my website is asthecrowfliesdesign.com. You can click on the courses and
Great.
find the course description and application.
Yeah, and the course is called Somatic Scribing Lab yeah.
Somatic Scribing Lab. Yeah, we're accepting applications until August 31st.
Yeah. Yeah. So real soon. I'm gonna get this this
I
this,
mean,
this interview is coming out like in a day. It's like a double feature. Yeah.
I guess I just felt like if you're a yes, you're a yes.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
If you're a yes, yeah.
Right on.
Mm.
Cool. Well, I totally want to have another interview like next year after you've gone through a cycle of this teaching, and then of course it's winter, so probably not going to do much in winter. Probably not going to. So sometime, next calendar year, we can do a part two and talk about things that you discovered, learned, and shared with people, because I just really feel that like there's a lot of people, like I'm in contact with like Nora Bateson and their warm data labs, and like Jeremy Johnson and integral and mutations, and a lot of people are starting to actually really try to get clear of the colonial epistemological trap to say, oh, even the way we talk about things is fucking us up. And so I think this somatic scribing, which is basically saying like communication is art and it's also research, like it's this kind of this flow of birth to death and back again and all the things in between. And can we have conversations that are like that in ways that are not just the same conversations over and over again,
Mm.
but actually the conversation starts to become alive through us, telling us things we can't predict.
Mm.
And I think somatic scribing is that great way of like the canvas, or whatever we're calling the cave wall, the canvas, that also becomes both a projecture, like we project onto it, and then that projection projects onto us, which is reflection, right? And then that process over and over again, especially with all the new technology we have to kind of like keep drawing over and writing, like it strikes me as a way that we can really iterate quite quickly, layer by layer, and also just keep seeing each layer. Like we could go back to go, what was the drawing we made on the first day? What was the drawing we made on the 10th day? And then those layers on top of each other are like a different kind of patterning, right? It's like, ooh, it's like a, right? And we're starting to do that. I think social media does that in a implicit way. In some ways, it does that accidentally on purpose, a kind of pastiche of like collaging.
Yeah.
And then to actually get very conscious about and mindful and somatic about and animist about the process to go, this isn't just a dead thing we're creating that then looks back at us with dead eyes. It's actually alive going, hey, reveal yourself to me now. And it's like, that kind of process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's totally a see and be seen
Yeah. Right. Right.
sort of
And see
oscillation.
yourself being seen. It's like,
Watch. Yeah.
Right. It's that real like animist interdependent compersion thing where you're like you're watching someone else fall in love and you feel something and then like it's like, which is wonderful, and also I think we need to build our capacity to hold that without without like falling over because of it, or like without having a overly wrought sense of doingness that we have to do something about that feeling, right? Because we're dealing with a lot of like can't deal with the intensity of reality.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's what animism is for. It's like you gotta lay there on the earth and breathe until you can deal with the fact that the earth is you, and also feeling you feel yourself through it. And then it's like wow, wow, wow. Like,
Yeah. That's a skill. That's a
yeah,
skill.
it's a real no, it's a real like practice to
Yeah.
that when you lay down, you're not just dissociating to
Mm-hmm.
sleep. You're laying down to actually feel more and feel differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that feeling is not an individualistic thing. It's an ecological
Yeah.
collective thing.
Yeah. And we can be in practice around like maintaining a sense of coherency and sort of titrating more complexity so that we
Yes,
can eventually at some point get to hold complexity and coherence.
that's right. Amen. Hallelujah. All the things. Yeah, no, for real. Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This is a great conversation. I love these kinds of conversations, and I'm looking forward to having more. Thanks everyone for listening. Kate, is there anything you'd like to say to sort of close out this conversation?
And so the beings that joined us in conversation today, and all of the sort of trauma spirits that we invoked, may you continue on the path towards just being honest with yourselves,
Yeah.
and may there just be lots of compassion that flows from this convo in to ourselves, and ourselves being each other
Yeah.
in these sometimes painful processes.
Yeah. Well, with that being said, thanks everyone. Everything's in the show notes. Patreon, again, Animist Arts, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.